We welcome back Emma Donoghue, literary historian and author. She's been with us all this week and will be here tomorrow night as well. Last night, we discussed the issue of women and a gendered identity. Tonight, we'll take a look at how society shapes and defines masculinity. Emma Donoghue, men have always been told to sort of suppress emotion and man up, you know, and psychologists refer to that as the gender straitjacket. What do you make of the ideas that boys are being socialized in this day to still fit that mold of manning up?
You know, it's interesting. I've sometimes wondered, you know, in say chats with school teachers and so on, I've sometimes wondered, is that in the back of their mind? You know, would they be saying exactly the same things about a girl as about a boy? I think there is a fear of boys being too theatrical or colourful or vulnerable, you know, wearing their hearts on their sleeves too much.
Is that a big problem still, do you think?
I don't know, it's a bit of a one. And boys themselves, of course, you know, they specifically model themselves on superheroes. So they're all going to feel a little bit lacking in muscle compared with their toys. I mean, boys' toys now, they all have these astonishing bulging muscles and sort of built-in guns, you know, all these cyborg bodies where any minute now your leg turns into a car. You know, I sometimes think boys must feel rather feeble and twiggy compared with their toys.
You know, your work on gender identity, your works generally focus on female characters and female identity. What do your male characters say about the social pressures on the male gender?
Actually, I think if you're a feminist writer at all, you're looking at gender for all your characters. So I'm just as interested in how my male characters are shaped by the gender straitjacket. In particular, in one of my novels, The Sealed Letter, it's about a Victorian divorce case. And the man in the divorce case, he was an admiral, so really formed by the British military. And he stayed in his terrible marriage for a long, long time before he suddenly snapped and he tried to divorce her. And I was fascinated by the particular constraints on his behavior. The way, for instance, you know, he grew up as a young man at sea in this very narrow bunk, and they had to literally make a little niche at the end for his feet because he was a very tall man. So he was so used to controlling himself, controlling what he showed the world in so many ways. Even the clothes of Victorian men, they had to be black all the time, no coloured ties for them. So I think really men like him were allowed a very limited range of behaviours. And, you know, they might have had more power and more prestige than women, but they didn't have more freedom. And often nowadays, you know, I look at the variety of clothes my daughter has, from sort of, you know, sporty shorts and pants right through to frilly dresses. And then the clothes in my son's drawers all seem kind of like each other. So sometimes I think we've allowed girls to expand and boys have stayed in this box.
You know, some professionals have sort of said that the nature versus nurture debate regarding gender identity is dead. One of the people that says this is Dr. Luann Brizendine, and I want to read you a little excerpt from her book called The Male Brain. Here's what the doctor wrote. It's commonly said that boys will be boys, and it's true. My son didn't turn Barbie into a sword because his environment promoted the use of weapons. He was practicing the instincts of his male brain to aggressively protect and defend. Those stereotypical girl toys I gave him for the first few years of life did not make his brain any more feminine any more than giving boy toys to a girl would make her more masculine. You have a young daughter and a son. Has this been your experience?
Yes, ours are a very classic girl and boy, but I think the important thing is to remember that it's the typically male brain we're talking about and the typically female brain. It doesn't mean that's how it is for every boy and every girl. And I think those who argue from a more sort of social constructionist point of view, what they're really saying is you know, the plotting of gender behavior falls on a sort of a graph, and you have to protect those at the two ends of the graph who don't quite fit in. And you have to make it possible for your boy to wear earrings and to love flowers. You have to make it possible for a boy who likes a doll to be able to carry his doll to the playground without being mocked. Nobody's saying that all boys are going to like dolls. So I suppose I've tried to be very relaxed with my kids that, no, I don't give any of them toys that they haven't asked for. So my daughter has 6 baby dolls and my son has a massive stash of Lego. But if my son picked up a doll, I wouldn't mock him or take it away from him, you know. I try and keep it flexible enough. But no, like most mothers of mixed sex children, I certainly say that my girl was from day one very different from my boy, and that's even in a family with two mothers. So I think the parental role models have very little effect. I think my girl shapes herself by looking at, you know, Disney princesses, and my boy by looking at Superman. Neither of them are looking to their parents in particular for a sense of what a man and a woman is. I think they get that from the media more broadly, and perhaps from their instinct. It's oddly unaffected by the parents that they have, in my experience.
Interesting, very interesting. Is there, when you're writing about male characters, is there a different process that you go through as a writer for shaping the male voice as opposed to the female voice?
No, I wouldn't say it's a different process, though actually I was at a reading at the Orange Prize recently with Aminata Forma, and she said for the male character in her book she taught herself to pee standing up using a handy little device called the whiz. So I've never gone that far, but I do think a lot about things like the clothes they're wearing and the physical actions they're performing, and what things they carry with them, you know, canes and umbrellas and guns and so on. But I would say writing about a man is often not at all as hard as writing about somebody of a different class from you. Because after all, you know, the men in your social circle, you mix with them all the time, you talk to them, you know what's going on for them. Whereas if you've never sat down and chatted to somebody who's sweeping your streets, you really might have no idea what's going on in their head. So I actually think class is a much bigger gulf than gender. I feel from having so many men in my life, I'm perfectly able to write a male character, and vice versa. I'm thinking of, say, you know, many amazing novels from the point of view of women have been written by male novelists. So I don't think novelists see that as a bar, really.
On Monday, we talked about your most recent novel, Room, and that universal message for modern parenting. The main character is Jack, the 5-year-old boy, and he is confined to one room to develop his sense of self. So what does that say? What does Jack's character say about society's influence then on male gender?
Well, I wrote Jack as a fairly typical boy because, yeah, I do think he's probably hardwired to have a lot of those qualities. And certainly I borrowed from my son a lot of things like the interest in toys and how they fit together and how they come apart. My son is a real deconstructor of toys. Jack doesn't bother cutting his hair, for instance, because he's never been out in the social world and looked around and thought, oh, boys are meant to have short hair. So in a few respects, he doesn't look like the typical boy. And then once he's in the outside world, he's suddenly made self-conscious about that. People are saying, oh, you must be a girl if you've got long hair. So I was trying to show that, you know, our society does fret a lot over tiny little details of how people look and what they play with and how they behave. Whereas I think if you were raised away from the world, you'd actually be much more relaxed about that because you wouldn't be constantly trying to look like the boys rather than the girls.
I want to change gears here a little bit and talk about how the themes that we're talking about manifest themselves in classrooms for students. And I want to read an excerpt from a Globe and Mail feature. This was back in October of last year. It was about the feminization of education. Here's what it says. A hill of data suggests that boys as a group rank behind girls by nearly every measure of scholastic achievement. They earn lower grades overall in elementary school and high school. They trail in reading and writing, and 30% of them land in the bottom quarter of standardized tests compared to 19% of girls. Boys are also more likely to be picked out for behavioral problems, more likely to repeat a grade, and to drop out of school altogether. All of these findings, Emma Donoghue, the researchers partially credit to the feminization of education. What do you make of that charge?
Well, like most mothers of boys, I'm actually very concerned about that, yes. I think elementary schools, as they're set up now, they do reward the most conformist, you know, compatible with the group, watching out for social cues kind of child, and that child is usually a girl. Yeah, my daughter seems to fit into the schooling system much more easily than my son. So I am concerned about that, and I'm particularly concerned that things we used to consider just part of how kids are, all the pushing and shoving and horseplay, you know, they're now seen as serious infractions. So the need to sit down, for instance, I think is very hard on a lot of kids, and maybe particularly boys. But then interestingly, there are other areas in our society that are still a very masculinized environment. I mean, I'm thinking of certain workplaces where you're encouraged to work till midnight every night, never spend time with your family, you know, go out drinking with the lads. I think a lot of women would find in a setting like that, it's just wrong for them, just as a lot of boys in kindergarten find that they're constantly being asked to sit quietly.
Many who have studied the plight of boys in schools cite English teachers who load their reading lists with female authors, with women's books. Authors like Margaret Atwood and Carol Shields, for example. Given that female authors weren't on the curriculum for such a long time, Do you see this modern day reading list as any sort of problem?
I think most teachers now have realised that to whet boys' appetite for reading, you absolutely have to give them not just books about boys, but books full of the qualities they like. I mean, my son loves the Captain Underpants series, for instance. You know, so full of rudeness and high-speed action and splat and exciting visuals. Certainly in trying to coax my son to read more, I'm seeking out very, very boyish books.
How old is he?
He's 7.
What are you telling him to read? Here's Emma Donoghue's boys' reading list.
I'm reading him things like Dr. Dolittle. I read him a lot of older books, but they do have to have a lot of plot and pace. But of course, that doesn't mean it has to be books by men. I mean, the Harry Potter series, for instance, has wooed a lot of boys towards reading. So I think it's absolutely crucial to let kids read books they enjoy. That's far more important than any other agenda about, you know, wanting a diverse range of authors on the reading lists.
I want to talk to you about video games because, interestingly, lots of psychologists and sociologists say video games are the culprit that do things like have boys more disinterested in reading and writing than girls. Are video games our problem?
Well, certainly, my son has only played little ones on an iPod, but he is absolutely attracted to them. I mean, it's like sugar for him, and he's naturally good at them. He's very intuitive about working out how to make things bounce and flick, things like Angry Birds, you know. He adores them, and it's something he can teach himself very easily. So I think used in moderation, they're a great reward system. You know, I'll say we'll do 15 minutes of spelling, and then you get 2 minutes on the iPod, and for him, that's worth it. So I think it's all about how you use things. But you certainly can't let your son just stay down in the basement playing video games all day. I mean, they'll hurt their thumbs, for one thing.
Or daughters, for that matter. Beyond the way we teach and raise our children is a larger question of how we value masculinity. And Dr. Leonard Sachs, who's the author of Boys Adrift, says it's a fundamental shift in pop culture. How do you see it?
Well, I don't know. I mean, if you look at the films that dominate cinemas still, there's still an enormous focus on laddish bad behavior, you know, like The Hangover, that kind of film, as superheroes. You know, I don't think those forms of masculinity have died out. I think sometimes people say that because muscle jobs are dying out, like being, say, a docker or a miner. A lot of those jobs are being replaced by machines. People worried there'll be nothing for men to do. But I mean, even in the sort of white-collar line of work, there are many very male-dominated jobs. It's an interesting observation that, say, Wikipedia, most of the contributors are men. I think that kind of obsessive interest in one specialist subject is extremely common for men rather than for women. So I think there will continue to be lots of jobs where men dominate. It's not ever going to be that every workplace is half and half men and women. I mean, there are natural tendencies. You just want to make it free enough that if your son wants to be a hairdresser, he can, and if your daughter wants to be a nuclear scientist, she can.
But when we look at pop culture television, you know, 40 years ago, men were in roles Father Knows Best. And now they're in roles like Homer Simpson, who's not a hairdresser, or, you know, the people in Family Guy. And to what extent, I mean, do we still need to go much further? I think everyone would agree we need to go further in sort of allowing the male identity to be broader.
Well, I mean, the ones you've mentioned are sort of extreme buffoons. But if you think of a show like Modern Family, it actually features 4 different highly competent fathers, you know, and they may have a different range of attributes, but they're all doing their job in a very solid way. None of them are just falling around haplessly while the women run the show. So I think there's actually quite a good range of roles for men. I mean, above all, what you want is a range of options, you know. You just don't want boys to feel they have to grow up to be this narrowly defined thing called a man. But there's so much emphasis on, you know, what men have lost, their authority and their prestige, but I think of how much they've gained. I look at the men of my generation, you know, men I was at college with, and they're passionate fathers. They are involved in their child's activities, from learning to read to changing nappies, in a way that my parents' generation, the men were more cut off. So I think that's been a huge gift for that generation of men. So it's not just that all their toys are being taken away from them. You know, I think they're actually being allowed to enjoy many things, such as child rearing, that, you know, were not on their agenda before.
Emma, thank you for the conversation.